Hello, my name is Arturo Contreras. I'm one of the research members that worked on the disproportionate learning disparities among students of color during the COVID-19 pandemic poster, alongside with Eunice Magana and Lebaron. We further investigate initial research on the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on students of color in K through 12. This team was interested in learning how exactly the pandemic has impacted diverse communities in areas such as health, employment, and education. The United States is known for its various resources available to different communities in promoting the support for education. Therefore, it is very well possible that various communities, as well as school districts, were impacted differently, causing a difference in learning experiences among students. This presentation, therefore, will then provide an overview of the knowledge we have gained over the effects of the pandemic and how it has impacted the school experiences and learning for low-income students of color in K through 12 education. During the COVID-19 pandemic, it was discovered that there were inequalities within several aspects such as access to education, technology, services, and many others. However, it is important to note that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, research suggests that there were many inequalities. The pre-existing inequalities ranged based on different dimensions, those of which included race, ethnicity, age, and geography. Within the realm of wage inequalities, it was found that when compared to men, women were earning lower than average wages. This discrepancy was also seen within employment rates. About 80% of men were found to be employed, compared to only 73% of women being employed. Adding the component of race, Pakistanis and Bangladeshis were found to have an employment rate of 39% and 75% respectively. Another study found that when asked about loss of income, about 16% of families were worried about losing almost 80% of the entire household income if employment was lost. An additional 20% of families were concerned about losing 60 to 80% of their entire household income. Further research was needed to investigate the existing inequalities within education prior to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Moving on to disparities in access to education, it's important to note that with the COVID-19 pandemic disrupting K-12 student education by shifting from an in-person instruction to an online setting, access to this new mode of education becomes more valuable in families of color and low-income families. This would mean that reliable internet, access to computers, and eventually the return to in-person instruction are matters that are structurally more important to low-income households and students of color who struggled with these issues prior to the pandemic. In wanting to understand such disparities in access to education, we looked at initial research such as Haderlein et al. 2021 that collected data from April 2020 to March 2021 from the Understand America survey that documented the K-12 educational access for 1,450 households. There, disparities were found across low-income households and along with race and ethnicity. As mentioned earlier, differences of access to computers and internet were found in households with low income, such as about 60% of households with income less than $25,000 reporting having access to computers and internet access, compared with the 92% of families with incomes of $75,000 to $149,000 having access to those resources. For remote and hybrid learners, 39% of those who come from the lowest income group reported internet connectivity issues. However, only 3% of high-income households reported those same connectivity issues. With students slowly returning to in-person learning during the fall of 21, differences between racial and ethnic groups were reported between November 2020 to May 2021. As we can see by the table produced by Haderlein et al., although in-person attendance increased from 28% overall to 50% in May 2021, about 60% of non-Hispanic white students were in person, versus the 37% of non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic students' attendance. In November of 2020, about 36% of non-Hispanic white students were attending in-person schooling, compared to only 18% of non-Hispanic Black students attending in person. Initial research finds that students who return to in-person learning tend to better in the education versus students who remain remote. The table that we included in our presentation, labeled as Table 8, breaks down further the percentage of students attending remote, hybrid, or in-person schooling. There you can see differing rates across race and ethnic groups. Overall, we find that Black students were the most heavily impacted by these gaps. Black students were least likely to have internet and computer for learning, and most likely to have no devices in the fall. Black students were also less likely to meet with their teachers in the fall, and were least likely to have access to in-person learning throughout the spring of 2021. As we will see later, gaining access to this new mode of education is important for K-12 students to continue growing in their education. These gaps will ultimately put students of color at a disadvantage, and only time will tell how these issues affect their education. Thank you.
When considering the pre-existing disparities in education faced by diverse students prior to the pandemic, as well as the difficulties in access that many students of color faced during the pandemic, it is not surprising that disparities in academic growth have been noted during the pandemic between students of color and their white counterparts. While few peer-reviewed sources have currently been published that show the true significance of the COVID-19 pandemic on academic learning, many studies are currently being conducted and reviewed. Preliminary data from the Curriculum Associates iReady assessment is presented in the article COVID-19 and Learning Loss: Disparities Grow and Students Need Help. This data shows that most elementary students have lost learning during the COVID-19 pandemic, but the loss suffered by students of color is greater. Prior to the COVID pandemic, academic learning disparities between white students and students of color already existed. The pandemic widened these disparities. The Curriculum Associates iReady assessment compared math and reading scores for hundreds of thousands of elementary students across the country between the fall of 2019 and the fall of 2020. On average, K-5 students at majority white schools showed a 69% growth from the fall of 2019 to the fall of 2020 compared to previous years. This indicates a 31% loss. In contrast, K-5 students with a majority student of color population showed only 59% growth, which is a 41% loss. In reading scores, the disparity was greater, with majority white schools showing a 90% student growth during this time frame, compared to majority color schools showing only a 77% student growth in reading. When considering the cause of these disparities, many factors are present. Research indicates that students of color had disproportionately less access to Wi-Fi and technology, as discussed prior. Furthermore, students of color reported less teacher interaction than their white peers throughout the pandemic. Family dynamics and structure, socioeconomic statuses, and parental assistance are other things to consider. Overall, though, it is important to be mindful of the increasing disparities in academic learning for students of color. Recovering from this loss will require intentional efforts by students, teachers, and parents, as well as the community, to best support these learners.